more resources, visit rym.org.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3.
The Local Youth Worker is a daily podcast that's centered on 5 questions each week. Ranging from the practical to the professional, we're looking for answers to the questions you're asking. Whether you're in full-time, part-time, or even volunteer youth ministry, this podcast is for you.
Hey everybody, welcome back. Talking to Walt Mueller this week, and we've been discussing a lot of issues related to pornography. Walt, we know that many of the statistics are telling us that those who struggle with porn, both inside and outside the church, are about the same. That is, Christians seem to be looking at pornography just as much as non-Christians. And I know there's, I think a statistic, I think it was 54% of pastors are admitting that they, look at pornography at least once a year or a few times a year. And so pastors are struggling with this issue. And so what's some advice and encouragement you would like to give to those, serving in youth ministry that are struggling with pornography? And we also you want to mention that we know this is not just a male issue. We know females struggle with this. And I know as we were kind of talking in between, Ellen Dykus at Harvest USA has been very helpful to point out we want to be sensitive as we're, two males discussing this. We want to be sensitive to our sisters in Christ who are struggling with this and acknowledge that this isn't just a male issue. So just some advice there, those serving in youth ministry who are, trying to minister to these students who are struggling with this, but they are struggling as well.
Yeah, and there's obviously this becomes more pervasive, the ability to access this stuff. And as we talked earlier in a different podcast about affordability, accessibility, anonymity, we need to be aware of this. So, and just a couple of comments there on how widespread this is. You mentioned male and female, and it used to be that the statistics were really, the scale was really tipped, if I may say, in favor of the males, that it was statistically many, many more males percentage-wise who were engaging with pornography, and engaging with pornography that was typically visual pornography. And we were hearing that there were fewer women percentage-wise, and that they were not drawn so much to visual pornography as they were to literary pornography, or what's called erotica, I guess. So, that could be anything from the Harlequin romance novels of years past that, if you go into a used bookstore, boy, you sure can't find them, huh? And so those, and then more recently, within the last 5-6 years, the 50 Shades of Grey books and the series and the films, and it's actually, and I can't quote a statistic on this, John, but it's actually evening out now. And so the scale is tipping to become more even. I don't know how even it is statistically, but I know it's tipping. And I also know that the visual pornography is now becoming much more of an issue with females. And with what we're learning about the human brain and neuroplasticity, the way the brain is wired, and how we can, through our behaviors, rewire our brains, and that can either be great news or it can be bad news. And certainly both sin and repentance are involved in that process. I mean, there's theological realities there. We know that the visual is really changing the male brain, but it's also now, and there's some research coming out on this, changing the female brain as well. And so we can only conjecture where that's going to go, but we can know that the destination, while we may not know where it is, it's going to be bad.
Yeah. And let me jump in before you give some advice there. Just something, maybe a thought that's maybe encouraging about this, as you're saying the scales are kind of evening out between males and females. I'm sure some of that, the statistics you said when they were more in favor of men, I'm sure some of that were females didn't feel that they could speak up about this and speak up that they could share this. And so we know that there are females now that are producing literature, that are being more outspoken, saying, look, you need to feel safe in admitting the struggle and in coming forth. And so hopefully some of the positive in that is people, at least in the church, are getting the message of, you can speak. This is a safe place to come and to seek help and to speak on this. And so obviously we want to encourage both males and females. I mean, that's where the fight against the struggle begins, is speaking up, seeking help, talking to somebody. And so, obviously wanting to encourage that. And so, any advice you want to give, Walt, again, those who are struggling in this area?
Yeah. Well, the first thing is for those who are not, and that would be, don't think that you're immune to this, because that's the most dangerous
Good. Yes.
assumption you can make, because now you're opening yourself up. And again, I would say what I've said before, and that is we all struggle, because we're all sexual beings, we all struggle with sexual brokenness at some level. And some of us struggle more with certain things, and others struggle more with other things. So don't think that you're immune. That would be the first thing. But then for those who struggle, I think to get accountability, to get this out in the open, to talk to someone about it, and to enlist the help of friends who can walk you through this, friends who are bent not on condemnation, but friends who are bent on showing the grace of Christ and leading you to an understanding of how Christ has taken these things on himself on the cross, and because of that we're seen as righteous by God. We've been adopted as sons and daughters. I mean, the gospel is beautiful in this. Now, that doesn't mean that the struggle will cease. I think for some it does, for others it continues, and that's where you need to get the help that you need to make sure this happens. So counseling is huge, but I want to say this. Just because someone is a Christian counselor doesn't mean they're a good counselor.
Good.
That could be a whole nother podcast, John.
Absolutely.
That's where I could go off on some things. I mean, a lot of people are getting counseling now, and Christian counseling training in some very suspect ways. And I would venture to say some of that includes some of the online training that's there. I have strong feelings on that. But anyway, let me go back and just say, find someone who is well trained and who has experience in this. And Christian counselors are a dime a dozen right now. Counselors are a dime a dozen. And it used to be, I'd say, find someone who sees the scriptures. And I heard someone else say this. I'm stealing it. I can't remember who I heard say it years ago. But find someone who sees the scriptures as the source of the solution rather than as part of the problem. Because there are many counselors who would write off, Christianity as and gospel message as, part of the solution or the solution. So now I'm saying find a Christian counselor who's gospel-centered, gospel-based, who's been well-trained and who has experience in dealing with these things. And I would say also go to some of the organizations that are most helpful. And Harvest USA would be one of the first ones I would point you to, harvestusa.org, because they've been dealing with sexual brokenness as not a counseling organization, but as a resource since the late 1970s. And these are people who recognize their own sexual brokenness, all of them, whether that's heterosexual, same-sex attracted, or whatnot, and they've dealt with a pornography issue. These folks would be really helpful to you as well. Yeah. But find some help. And, let me throw one more thing in here, if that's okay. And that is that if your pornography issue or any sort of sexual brokenness as a youth worker is putting you in a situation where you're attracted to kids, you're attracted to parents, you are feeling strong inclinations and pressures to cave to these desires and engage in, sinful behavior, run, get out. And one of the reasons why I say that is it's not just to do the right thing, it's to keep you from doing the wrong thing. And I tell youth workers this all the time. You are just one bad decision away from being a newspaper headline. And John, I've shared this with you. I went on a Google image search about 5 years ago for youth pastor, and I was surprised at what popped up at the time was a quarter to a third of what I saw on the screen of the images that came up were youth pastors, and they were mug shots. That really hit me pretty hard. And I know my own vulnerabilities, and I pray that God would reveal my own vulnerabilities to me more deeply all the time, because I know they're there, and I have to know them. So, and make up your mind now that we talked in an earlier podcast about fleeing. Make up your mind now that if you face this scenario, that scenario, this scenario, flee from it. And youth workers, do not put yourself in positions where you're with a student alone. Boy, that's one way youth ministry has changed since I got started. We have to think about this now.
Yeah. Yeah. And kind of, you talking about getting help, and you mentioned, counselors. Any advice? I know that, this has been discussed on this podcast, and a lot of people highlight this, of those who are in ministry do not feel like there's a lot of places they can go within their church to admit that they're struggling, and seeking accountability. For some in the ministry, if they open up about their struggle, there are those church contexts where they can ask them to step down or whatever. And without a doubt, there are times where people do need to step down, and that's something we'll discuss a little bit more tomorrow. But just advice to those youth workers who are struggling and thinking, can I seek accountability from a group of friends in the local church, or should I go outside? To people who aren't even in your same state, maybe online or however. Just some advice there, some thoughts there.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm not sure I'm equipped to answer well. By the way, I've learned how to answer questions that way. If someone asks me a question, I don't have to have an answer. I can say, I'm not sure. But that said, I think I would guess that the answer to that question varies, because a lot depends on your church and your church culture. Because I think there are some churches that are far too grace-based, if that's possible. I know that sounds strange, but you know what I'm saying there. We're going to let anything slide. Nah, no worries, don't worry about it. And there are some churches that are far too law-based, and they're not going to show grace. And I think a lot depends on the kind of church that you're in, and I would hope that churches would really work hard. I'm fortunate to be in a church where grace and law, grace and truth are really well balanced, and discipline is done well. And that's one of the great things about our Reformed system when it operates properly. And I've seen that in my church, and I'm blessed to be a part of a place like that. Yeah, I'm not sure. And I will say this, another thing, if you get asked to leave, don't go running somewhere else to jump in and do ministry where they'll let you. You got to deal with yourself. And I think sometimes we deal with ourselves, or we're dealt with too quickly.
Yeah, no, I think that's wise. Basically just using wisdom, using discernment, knowing your church culture, but also too, if there's a youth worker listening to this and they realize, okay, this is becoming a big struggle and I can't get control over it. We need to encourage those youth workers to speak up and say, this could cost you your job, but you're putting yourself in danger, you're putting your students in danger, and so not to just seek to try to cover this up and keep it in the dark, and it's just going to grow. But maybe some of that will get into the discussion we'll have tomorrow of when is the point when you might need to step down from ministry because of this struggle. So before we get into that tomorrow, anything else you want to add, Walt, as we close out?
No, I just appreciate the time to have this discussion, because I do think it's important.
Absolutely. Well, thanks again.